My name's Paul Horvath. I work with a company called Sports Lawyer. Emily Lupo is from the same company as well if there's any questions afterwards. We are presenting today on risk management. There's a couple of handouts that are coming around. One relates to risk management around director duties within your organisations, and there's a second handout on coaches' legal liability that's available when you exit to collect if your organisation needs some tips for coaches. Just briefly in terms of my background, I run a boutique legal practice in the City of Melbourne. Over half of our work is in the sports sector. We represent a range of clients from AFL clubs through to pigeon racing associations and everything in between. I recently represented Mark Thompson in the Essendon Supplements case and have plenty of experience at Court of Arbitrations for Sport and so on. So I've seen a range of sporting disputes that can arise. So my topic today is risk management. Just give you a definition. Risk is an inevitable and unavoidable component in organisational growth and development, providing both opportunities and potential threats to the health of an organisation. Risk management involves not only taking protective measures, but also evaluating opportunities and, where appropriate, taking considered risks designed to facilitate the growth and development of the organisation. Essentially, ensuring that all board members and the organisation has appropriate insurance cover in the paid sense to an insurance company. But also what we'll talk through today is insurance steps that you can take as an organisation to minimise the chance of any legal liability. So, the two parts of the brief presentation today is the Board of Directors and risks issues around board members or committee of management members or committee members of clubs, and then we'll talk a bit about coaches after that. So you'll see from the handout that you've got that there's a range of duties that board members have under the laws. So that's mainly the Associations Incorporations Act, because I imagine most of you are from incorporated associations as opposed to, say, a limited liability company, which might be a bigger organisation. So there's a range of obligations on board members. One of the key things, and we'll come to it in a bit more detail later, is that a lot of what a board can and can't do is set out in the Constitution. So the board really needs to know what's in the Constitution. And so we'll come to later, one of the things that perhaps as a practical step you can do is have a board induction pack, so that when anyone joins your board, you give them a pack including the Constitution, perhaps any policies and other documents, so that everyone knows what the Constitution says and so on. That tells you as a board what you can and can't do. That sets your limitations and so on. There's also the legal limitations, which is you're not allowed to act in a conflict of interest. You're not allowed to act for an improper purpose, and we'll come to a few examples of that in a moment. So the duties that committee of management members have, board members, is to exercise due skill and diligence, to genuinely make an effort to act properly when they're making decisions, to avoid conflicts of interest, to keep proper books of account, so the financial records must be appropriately kept and audited each year, to act for the benefit of the association as a whole and not just perhaps certain groups, say one team within your club and just acting for that team, for example, is acting for an improper purpose as a committee member. Not improperly using the board position, acting honestly and in good faith, and as I say at the bottom, director insurance is something that I recommend. I've heard that it can be as little as $100 for small organisations, but it can mean that board members can rest easy knowing that if anything goes wrong, that they're not going to lose their house, and sometimes that's a concern for getting volunteers onto your board. The example of board members getting sued is, most of you are too young to remember, a guy called John Friedrich, who ran something called the National Safety Council. I think it was in the 80s in Victoria. He was obviously a bit of a rogue and siphoned off nearly $100 million of money within the organisation. But what he was doing as he was going along was producing dodgy books, so the accounts of the organisation, and the board was signing off on those improper accounts. And you might think, well, I'm going to rely on the accountant on our board because he knows about books of account, and I'll let that person tell me that the accounts are all okay. And amongst other things, the law says that that's not good enough. You have to satisfy yourself and be sure that the accounts are all in order. And the end result there was that the members of the National Safety Council, the board members, were volunteers, they were unpaid, yet the court held them personally liable for the total debt of $92 million, which was distributed amongst the different board members. So it's just, that's the extreme example, but that's what can happen even if you're a volunteer for an organisation. The court can say, well, if you're not properly checking the financial records of the organisation and making sure that the audited accounts properly reflect the state of the organisation, I imagine in this case it crept up over a number of years, the court was basically saying you didn't do your job properly. Plenty said on good governance, and I endorse everything said by the first two speakers. All of those steps about making sure things are being done properly in your organisation is what you need to be doing as a risk management or an insurance type strategy. As it says there, no one size fits all, so I'm obviously talking in general terms about what's proper for different organisations, and you've got to adapt that to your particular club, but just making sure things are documented properly. If you're concerned about something being done, send an email to someone, send an email to the club president or what have you. I'm concerned about this issue, what have you. It's in writing, asking that someone deal with a particular issue. We've got faulty equipment around the premises, etc. Ensures that you're covering yourself off to try and make sure issues get dealt with. So on that simple practical level. There's a great paper that's referenced on the next page of my slide. It's also in the handout that we've given from the Australian Sports Commission, which is, it's a long paper, but you can probably hunt through that Sports Commission guidelines on best governance practices. It's designed for larger organisations, but there's plenty of take-out suggestions in there. It talks about planning, documenting, implementing, monitoring, evaluating various procedures that you have in your organisation. There was talk by the last two about where do you get your board members from. It might be handy to have an accountant on your board, so you might look at just outside your sport for that. That's an example that good governance principles refers to. You might have board processes that might be documented so that a certain standard procedure is followed at board meetings and so on. Some of this is time consuming at the start, but can lead to really smooth processes. And particularly if you want to grow your membership and so on, attract sponsors and so on, the better you run your organisation, the more likely you're going to be able to attract that sponsorship, and you'll be recognised for your good practices, I'm sure. And there's a range of stakeholders within every club, etc. As we've said, there's the supporters or fans who come to the matches or events. There's sponsors and so on, and you've got to keep in touch with all of those various stakeholders within an organisation. So as a board, I guess one of the things is boards are, if you like, the mind of the incorporated club or association, and then the volunteers, the coaches, the team managers, if you're lucky enough to have a part-time worker for your club or organisation, then those are what you call the hands of the organisation putting into practice what's in the policies. So you've got a policy, whether it's about non-harassment taking place or something, member protection's a common one, and just making people aware that if anything improper happens, there's a complaints process within this club that you can lodge a complaint, and then we'll deal with that within the organisation. And you've also got to monitor those policies, review them every now and then, and the suggestion is every 12 months, but certainly being aware that things are up to date. And I guess on a bigger level, the Constitution being such an important document, where legal issues arise is in the Constitution, and they can often be out of date. And that's the case with state sporting organisations, so organisations representing all of Victoria might have a constitution that's 30 years old, and I see legal issues arising because the constitution's unclear, and one person says, well, this is how it works and this is how it should work, and the organisation says, well, no, has a different view, and then they end up in court because the wording of the constitution's unclear. So those sorts of documents need to be reviewed to make sure they are crystal clear and up to date. So that can often lead to difficulties. And Dale Waitman, I'm a Richmond supporter, so I took an interest in this case, and Dale Waitman was a famous Richmond player. After he retired from AFL football, he went to play in Tasmania, and the long story is, or the short story, he got rubbed out close to the finals, and he went to see a lawyer, and a clever lawyer found an argument that because the Constitution lacked meaning in various parts, the proper power wasn't given through the Constitution to the tribunal to impose penalties. So the court said that the suspension that he'd been given was unlawful. So they had no power to give that suspension in the first place, threw it out, and the practical consequence usually is that the organisation would have to pay the legal costs because of that error in the Constitution. So that's just an example of where your Constitution's not up to date, it can leave you a bit at risk. Now I'll just quickly rip through a couple of dot points. Sorry, how do I go back? Backspace, there we go. Strategic plan is something every club can do, so plan out what are we going to do for the next 12 months. Do we want a 12-month plan? Do we want a 2 or 3 year plan ideally? So you've got targets that you're aiming for. We want this much membership in 1 or 2 or 3 years, and then you've got steps that you're taking to get to that result, and you measure yourself against that every 6 or 12 months and say, how are we going here? We've got to change tack, etc. Making sure everyone, all the key stakeholders understand that strategic plan, reviewing the organisation and the key personnel, reviewing how the board members are going within your organisation, doing what they're supposed to be doing. And probably not applying to most clubs is creating specialist subcommittees. Okay, if I can just briefly touch on the coaching aspect. I know there's a proportion of coaches in here, but clubs will have coaches within them. Negligence claims can come up against coaches, and the biggest one is there's a case called Foscolis, which was a 2002 Supreme Court decision where a coach was not properly supervising a wrestling match at the Footscray YMCA, and one of the wrestlers, who was much more experienced than the other wrestler and probably had 20 kilos extra bulk on him, performed a suplex throw, drove him into the mat and broke his neck, so he's a quadriplegic. It resulted in a $5.7 million damages claim, essentially against the coach, and whilst there was $5 million of insurance coverage for that claim, the 70-year-old then coach had to face a personal damages bill of $700,000, being the amount over the $5 million, as a result of what happened, because the court found that he didn't properly supervise that situation. So that's an example of negligence. And I'll say, I'm sure I'll certainly be making these slides available to the organisers if you want to get a hold of them. In terms of monitoring the risk, you've got to look at what's the chance of injury. So obviously in that case there was mismatched people, serious injury could arise. If it's just someone running around a track, obviously there's not much that can generally go wrong. Age, size of participants, any injuries they might have, and so Now I'm pretty close to the 15 minutes. There's some contact details there, again, which will come up. We put out newsletters, which you can email us about to get onto our newsletter list. We're on Facebook. We put out regular information bulletins, and also at Twitter we put out regular information updating you as to things that you need to know in sport. So thanks for your time.